Two very famous notes in the repertoire. This is the same actual drum, but these notes sound different to each other. Let's listen again. We will look later at how and why this same drum can have two different sounds. This array of timpani covers more than 300 years up to the present day. If one drum can have two different sounds, how about those at each end of this range? They sound completely different. And they're suitable for totally different kinds of music. Timpani having a very wide variety of sounds and uses over 300 years isn't all that surprising. But what is really extraordinary, I think, is that despite how very different all of these instruments sound, function and look, all of the types of drums that have ever been made all share exactly the same short and simple name. This video is about why there aren't proper names for different types of timpani, why this happened, and why now this has become a bit of a problem. But also, as we take a close look at all these drums alongside each other, we will see if we can spot some patterns that might just lead us to a new, clear and simple way to address this tricky and important question. To present these ideas properly, there's quite a lot of information, some of which may be new to some people, and there's a lot of important detail, and so I've decided to make two videos. In this, part one, I'm going to very quickly touch on two massive subjects, and then we will look at some video clips to understand what happened with composers and timpani. I'll then talk about how drums were used and developed, and then at the end comes the new bit, an idea which seems to offer us a clear and simple way forward. In the second film, I will go into some more depth on some of the points raised in part one and try to anticipate some questions that people may have and hopefully provide some answers. And there will also be some more excerpts played on different drums. In this film, there's only time to mention some points briefly, and so from time to time you'll see this sign pop up. Before we start looking at timpani, it might be useful if we see what happened with some other instruments and their names. In terms of size, violins have hardly changed at all. Instruments made in the Baroque era are still extremely sought after, and these are copied today for use in all areas of music. Generally speaking, one violin can undergo some quick conversions and then be suited to any period of music, and so the violin has kept the same name throughout history. During the period we're looking at, keyboard instruments have mostly had the same functions, either as a chamber or accompanying instrument, or playing alone or as a soloist with an orchestra. Due to dramatic changes, these have clearly become different instruments. There's a lot of overlap with repertoire, but they have now formed very clear identities and have survived independently, and so they were given different names. Violins and other string instruments kept their names because they didn't change very much, and keyboards changed so much they had to change names. But timpani are in a funny middle ground where they changed a lot but were never given any changes of name. What an incredible difference the violin is to the timpani. You can play Stravinsky on a Stradivarius, but you can't remotely play Bartók on a drum from Baroque times. The main reason for a total lack of proper classification for timpani, I think, is actually pretty clear. Changes in timpani design were always gradual and constant, and quite simply, there were never any definite or dramatic enough points where the time was right for anyone to suddenly suggest that a new name was now required. Slowly but surely, drums transformed further and further away from their ancestors, and after 300 years of steady change, what started as a specific name has ended up becoming, at best, an umbrella term for what is now a very large group of highly diverse instruments. Although various informal ways of describing timpani have appeared at various times, we'll see later on why they are all either vague, confusing or unhelpful. It's fairly easy for everyone to hear and describe differences in the sound of drums, but there are many factors that affect timpani sound, and for any of us to understand and explain how and how much each of these contribute to change is very difficult indeed. And this is partly also because it's quite impractical to do experiments. This is why I chose these excerpts at the beginning, to show that we can change the sound and know exactly how we did that. The differences here are the heads and the sticks. Sticks are obviously incredibly important, but while they greatly affect the front of the note, what is important for this film is the actual sound of the drum, which is surprisingly separate from the impact sound. If we hear these notes with the impact removed, then what we find out is very interesting, since we hear that the drums themselves have their own sounds, and these are not changed very much by using different sticks. And so, when watching the various clips that are coming up, I'd encourage you to try to ignore the consonant at the start of the note, and instead focus closely on how the drums behave after that point. In this film, I talk quite a lot about sustain and decay, and so let's just quickly see how these things are subtly different. Decay refers to the time it takes for the amplitude of a sound to decrease after its peak from the initial attack, and sustain refers to the level of sound that is maintained. Here, the head is quite thick, plus it is lapped onto the counterhoop, which also reduces resonance. But here, this head is quite a bit thinner and manufactured in a different way. The first note sounds more drum-like and has a faster decay and a lower level of sustain, and with the second one, the pitch is clearer. It is thought that thinner heads started to be used more widely around the middle of the 19th century, and so we suspect that what Beethoven heard and wrote for is closer to the first drum. These subtle variations on the same drum lie at the absolute heart of what this whole subject is about, and why we might change heads will soon become apparent. Let's listen to a longer passage to hear those differences. We just heard how changing one single thing affects the sound of a drum, and so when we think about all of these things on all timpani, it might seem that this is all going to get terribly complicated. But actually, we don't need to focus on any particular details of the drums, as all this is much more interesting, I think, if we focus on what happened with the music. In the next few minutes, for the main part of our investigation, let's look at three big questions. How composers developed how they wrote, orchestras changed over time, and drums adapted to cope with these changes. The orchestra you're going to hear in most of these clips uses historical instruments, and for me, deciding which drums to use for a particular project usually involves practically no personal choice, since the choice of drums is based on two things. Firstly, what kind of drums were around when the piece was written and first performed, and secondly, how big the ensemble is. It's obviously not possible to cover the whole development of timpani right now, but there are links in the description box to my videos which look at that in more detail. First of all, let's see how composers wrote for timpani and how this developed. Timpani began by playing in a way that was mostly loud and rhythmic, with short note values. After a time, composers started to change how they wrote for us, adding dynamics and more subtle playing. As orchestras and drums got bigger, composers asked for longer and louder sounds. As thinner heads and different kinds of sticks became more widely used, new colours and techniques were discovered and explored. Around this time, composers constantly needed timpani that were bigger and louder. Over time, our role as a bass instrument increased. And the trend for bigger and longer sounds continued well into the 20th century. We might say that around the turn of the 20th century, the standard symphony orchestra reached its maximum size. But due to constant development, particularly with brass instruments, orchestras continued to get louder. The very largest symphonic timpani arrived in the middle of the 20th century, as did plastic heads, and these are affected far less by climate. Drums like these, therefore, have a totally reliable range at all volumes and can repeatedly play lots of notes much lower and louder than these, and this presented great opportunities for composers, particularly of film music, to use timpani in their own dramatic and exciting styles. In just 100 years or so, orchestras transformed dramatically from expanded chamber music in private courts to full symphony orchestras in enormous concert halls. To expand a string section by a very long way, the most important thing is to add more players. In wind and brass, both the number of players increased, plus there were changes of instruments. But timpani are unique, because it is the only instrument where change was only about instruments and not players. And the extent of this change is remarkable. Let's listen to all those drums again when they have to play in the loudest music of their time. Even when the ensemble is very small, you find that you're playing drums near to their maximum limit. When you have a drum which is required to play near its upper limit, then at all dynamics you tend to find that articulation is much less of an issue. And so we don't need to worry so much about sticks, as clarity comes more from the drum itself. If anything, rather than needing to reduce or compress the sound, you tend to find that the opposite is the case, and we need to help the sound come out. Often you have the feeling that the drum is almost not able to cope with anything more. Perhaps we think of Mendelssohn as a lighter style of music, but here, with a medium-sized orchestra, fortissimos can have maximum energy. A medium-sized drum played near to its limit sounds very different to a large one which isn't. And as you'll see in a moment, damping for articulation and clarity isn't necessary when you're able to play at these levels. I sometimes call this full fat playing, meaning that there is no need to reduce anything. And when the drums are this small, this style of playing works for composers like Mendelssohn. And even long after the time of composition. As orchestras continued to grow and get louder, more power was needed. And drums became larger and even more resonant. For the very largest pieces with the biggest orchestras, even with the loudest timpani, if it was possible that one player might not be loud enough, then composers such as Mahler simply added another one. If, at all stages, timpani were played up to their maximum levels of volume, then it stands to reason that at each point timpani survived until such time as they were literally not able to be played any louder. And then bigger and more powerful drums were developed to fit these new musical styles. The true Baroque period ends in the 18th century, but partly because there were no other names for timpani, this term is often used to mean any drum with tuning taps, or even anything without a pedal. Although these timpani share some characteristics with earlier and smaller drums, they were actually built over 100 years later for symphony orchestras that are 3 or 4 times as big. And so, whatever we do want to call them, surely it can't be Baroque timpani. If you say to a timpanist, a 26 and a 29, or a 66 and a 74, then if we are talking about drums from the 20th century onwards, this is fine. It seems likely that this terminology became popular partly because of the advent of plastic heads, because manufacturers needed to classify off-the-shelf products. Diameter is fine when talking about 20th century timpani because, compared to earlier drums, the bowls are the same kinds of sizes and proportions to each other. A very wide variety of heads are used on symphonic drums, and they can be played really quite differently, but because they're all designed for the largest orchestras, the drums themselves are relatively similar to each other. When we look at the whole range of timpani, you can see that a 24-inch drum is many different things. For symphonic timpani, a 24 might be the smallest drum of a set of 4, and so it plays some of the highest notes that we need. But just 100 years before, the low drum for classical repertoire would have been roughly this size. And in between, for all sorts of timpani, this was a typical size for what we call the D drum, the smaller one of the main pair. Looking at timpani from Baroque times, drums as large as this hardly existed. As well as being able to play notes at opposite ends of the range, drums of the same diameter can have wildly different bowl volumes, meaning that they have very different levels of volume, sustain and decay. All in all, when we're talking about all kinds of timpani, using diameter alone is really not very helpful. While the term Baroque timpani might work for 18th century drums, and talking about diameter works for the 20th century onwards, this leaves a gap of an entire century in the middle, which just so happens to be the most important period of change for timpani. The 19th century is complicated, but all we need to do in order to understand what happened is to look at just this one picture. This was painted in 1900, and even if it's based on a memory as much as 20 years older than that, then what it shows is very revealing. When we look closely, we can see that the timpani are pretty small and shallow, with an early and slow hand tuning system, and so we can date these as a style of at least 50 years before. What is absolutely crucial is that at the same time, another unrelated Strauss, Richard, was writing extraordinary, new and radical timpani parts to be played in enormous orchestras. And a very important person was building new timpani in order for these parts to be playable. Johann Strauss was a touring musician, and his small, light operetta orchestra didn't need the latest, greatest and loudest machine timpani. Just a very quick look at these two pieces composed within a few years of each other by these two friends shows us the differences very starkly. While we've seen that new timpani were introduced when louder instruments were required, what we don't have so much knowledge about is how much smaller ones were still used. But this painting confirms that, at least as late as 1900, including in top-level ensembles, different sized timpani were used according to two things: how big the orchestra was and how complicated the timpani parts were. In the 20th century, things changed, and for interesting reasons. To put this quite simply, for now, in quite a short time, a lot of orchestras were formed and many new, larger concert halls were built. These orchestras played a very wide range of repertoire, crucially often in a single concert. And since the players were salaried and the acoustics were large, a trend began to play all the time with large forces. Timpanists obviously had to use drums that would cope with the largest piece in the programme. But in any case, because small forces were rarely used anywhere, it is easy to see why shallow bowled timpani became almost entirely extinct for the majority of the 20th century, and the knowledge and skills for playing them almost completely disappeared too. It seems already that the 21st century is more like the 19th, in that, once again, orchestras vary greatly by size. From the 19th century we have the knowledge that the style of timpani was inextricably linked to the size of the ensemble, and so this can give us some useful pointers as to how we might wish to play now. In this film we have seen very briefly how naming works with some other instruments, and also we've touched upon what affects timpani sound. And then we looked at timpani through the ages in several ways. Broadly speaking, we found that, over time, composers wanted longer sounds, and as harmony and orchestration evolved, our role as a bass instrument increased, having had a much more rhythm-based starting point. Very generally, we can see steady increases in both the size and volume of orchestras, and so timpani changed, with the primary need being simply that, as time went on, drums needed to produce more and more volume. And this had the direct and interlinked knock-on effects of increasing the length of the note the drum produced, also partly to do with heads creating a sound with a clearer pitch. Whether composers drove changes in the drums or the other way around, for now what is extremely important and helpful to keep at the front of our minds is that all of these changes happened together with a direct relationship to each other. We see that the length of notes both written and what we hear gradually and consistently increases over time. Although tempos obviously vary very wildly, as a very rough way to express this, we could say that there's an increase at a rate of about 1/8 note or quaver every 50 years. While I'm certainly not claiming that we can suddenly name all types of timpani, what is straightforward is to turn some very consistent patterns into a sliding scale, and this can classify drums according to what they sound like. I've chosen the letter Q primarily from the English word quaver, as a simple and memorable starting point. But also it feels like this letter has connections to measuring things. By adding just one number, we instantly have a very clear and snappy way of identifying and comparing different types of timpani. There are many interesting and historic styles or schools of timpani playing, but I really hope that this isn't seen like this. Of course, you might not like how I'm expressing things, but I hope we could agree at least that this idea is all about what we can observe from history, rather than it being a set of opinions on how to play. To go back to the examples at the beginning of this film, if we consider that we might call drums from Bach and Handel's time 2Q, and then this value steadily increases until music of the present day, we can quickly build up a feeling for how all these sounds, volumes and the sizes of drums interrelate. And in between those extremes, we saw a subtle variation which showed, crucially, how we can change the Q value of one individual drum. In this clip, the orchestra is a similar size to that of the first performance, and so we could say 4Q. But in the second, the orchestra was considerably larger because we performed in a much larger concert hall. The lower the Q number of a drum, the quicker and smaller these values are, meaning that we need to damp much less. And so this explains why I felt I wanted timpani that had a slightly higher Q number. Although as players we don't tend to scientifically measure sustain and decay, we all know we have to deal with these every day, because we need to damp notes if they ring on too much. When we think back to how the size of orchestras and timpani increased together, we can also say that Q can relate to orchestra size, with perhaps approximately 8 to 12 players per Q number. Q also works for sustaining percussion instruments, and maybe brass instruments too. And so although my starting point for Q was based around timpani, potentially it has uses in much wider areas of music. Up to now, I've been expressing everything as a timeline with increases happening along it. But now, as we consider how to approach performance, this is a lot more complicated, and it certainly isn't the case that Q always increases with time. For example, Beethoven's premiere of his 7th Symphony had a much larger orchestra than his earlier symphonies, and so this means there's a larger Q number. And we can compare this to the medium-sized orchestra that Brahms used 50 years later. And so perhaps it is more helpful, rather than to think of Q purely in terms of time, but more as an expression of levels of power. We are very near the end of this film now, but I'm anticipating there may be lots of questions about some of the ideas I've talked about here. And so please follow the link below to watch the second film, which hopefully answers many of the questions you may have. There will also be a lot more musical examples, and there will be a lot more on how we can practically use Q, not as a strict and inflexible dogma of which drums we must play, but more as a guide for comparison to perhaps better understand how we can use the instruments and techniques we have to increase our range of sounds and approaches to different kinds of music. Here are a few of the excerpts we've seen with some Q numbers added, and right at the end to play us out there's a passage from one of the most important pieces ever written, both for orchestras and timpani in particular. These are two quite different interpretations by different types of orchestra, but in both cases hopefully the timpani sound is exciting and near the limits, just as Berlioz intended.